Bloody March flies. G'day everyone and welcome to our channel. As you can see in the background behind me, we've recently added a shipping container to our off-grid setup, and it's been super convenient for keeping our tools and equipment out of the elements. The part that wasn't as convenient though was trying to figure out whether we should get a new or a second-hand shipping container, where to buy it from, how to avoid some of the scams out there, and how to find somebody who can deliver it for a fair price. And so in today's video, I'll be sharing with you what we learned in the process of answering these questions for ourselves, and how much it all cost in the end, and how we managed to save a few dollars along the way. You'll also see how the shipping container was actually delivered to the site, and how we went about elevating it off the ground and making sure that it's all level. And so the first question that we had was one that seemed obvious at first, and that's whether we should get a second-hand or a new shipping container. Being mindful of keeping our expenses down, I was sure that a second-hand container will be the way to go for us. But when I contacted some of the listings out there with second-hand shipping containers for as cheap as $2,500, I either didn't get a response from the seller, or they told me that they didn't have any at that price range. So when I sent out a few inquiries for the second-hand shipping containers, the real price ended up being between $3,000 and $4,000. And now, keeping in mind that the second-hand containers are normally about 15 years old and nearing the end of their serviceable life, what I couldn't help but notice was that for about $2,000 extra, we could get a single trip container that was essentially 15 years newer, looked almost brand new, smelt nice, has easily opening doors, and wouldn't need any serious repairs for at least 10 years, after which we could still sell it for a pretty good price. And so needless to say, this is the path that we chose to go down, because knowing how well these things retain value and how much effort the panel beating and rust proofing and painting would take, we decided to get this lovely container that's good to go from day one. But you know, if you persist at finding a good deal, you can essentially have two rusty old containers for the price of one new one. So of course this choice depends on what you're looking to use this for, your budget, and how confident you are in your panel beating and repair skills. So for us, I use this container every single day, and the experience of how nice it is really unbeatable, because the walls are nice and smooth on the inside and on the outside. The hinges have these greasing points that make them feel brand new. The floor is clean and smooth, and there's no smell, and there are venting points on the walls to minimize dampness and mold growing in there. So to answer the question of where we bought this container from and how much the final cost was, generally the single trip newer containers are only available from depots, and so that's the route we took. And it also gave me extra peace of mind dealing with a registered business that had a good reputation. But having said that, if there was a near new container that was for a really good price and it was really nice on a private listing, I wouldn't hesitate to go and check that out. I would just be a little bit skeptical if the seller was asking for a deposit, or if their rating was really low on whichever platform they're on. And so the good thing in Australia about all of the main depots, at least in our area, is that they also advertise on Facebook Marketplace and Gumtree. So if you go to those search engines, you'll be able to see private listings alongside the depots to be able to compare prices. The only thing to be mindful of is that a lot of the time the businesses, they want to make their listings extra competitive. So they'll put their price slightly below the average price. But once you give them a call, once they get you through the door, they'll say, oh, actually, there's none at that price point at the moment. And they may be a little bit more expensive than the cheaper price that they have online. All right, so finally, as an example for how much you can expect to pay for a single trip near new shipping container in Australia in 2023, we contacted every single depot within reach for us, and the best price that we've been able to secure was $5,700 including GST. And mind you, some of the depots quoted us a price for pretty much the same container that was $1,000 higher. So that's just the best price that we've been able to get in this situation. All right, so when talking about some of the scams out there, this is an example that was somewhat obvious from the beginning, but I decided to message them anyway just for fun to see what they're all about. So as you can see in these few screenshots that I took, the business info page on Facebook Marketplace actually has an address that differs from the address that the seller provided when I asked to inspect their containers. In fact, the address listed on the business info page didn't even exist. And when I checked the address that they provided via Google Earth, I saw that it was just some random farm with a couple of shipping containers there, but it looked nothing like the pictures of the depot where the containers were supposedly stored. And the second giveaway was that the pricing of $3,200 for their new build single trip containers was half the cost of the normal going rate. And sure enough, when I asked about the containers in the listing, this price jumped to $4,300. And when I asked if that means it's $4,730 including GST, they replied with, "Yes, please." So this one's just strange from the get-go. Others might be more elaborate, and I don't get why shipping containers attract so many scammers. And this is why we should all choose to deal with reputable businesses instead of random internet ads that seem too good to be true. But the thing that I've found to be mindful of is not to fall for the marketing images, because a lot of the time the seller will have their best containers in the photos, which have no rust, no dings, but when it comes to actually receiving the container that's on offer, it may be a little bit different to what you saw in the marketing images if you don't go and check it out first. So using our container as a case study, the photos that I received were 12 months old. So when I went to go and check out the container, I saw that some of the rust areas were a little bit bigger than in the images, and I used this info to bargain another $200 off the price of the container, which to me was worth taking the time to go and check it out. And yes, a lot of people will say that surface rust is normal in shipping containers, which it is. And the surface rust is also called patina, which is a protective layer that cotton steel has when it begins to rust, basically. But of course, on our land, we've got a shipping container that's fully rusted out as a reminder of what rust can do when left unchecked. So when looking at shipping containers, I always prefer the original paint over the patina coating. And so the last consideration for inspecting shipping containers is how much time you have to spend on the entire process. So if, like in our case, you're driving an hour or so to see one shipping container, then you're just going to see one shipping container for that 1 hour's drive, which turned out okay in our case. But obviously, if you go to a depot with many shipping containers, you'll be able to see many shipping containers for the same drive time. And if the person there actually commits to seeing you in person, you may even have more room for negotiating a price, considering they'll see that you're there and you're ready to purchase the container. So onto the delivery considerations and cost. The delivery part of this process is actually pretty straightforward, because all you'll need is a simple tilt tray tow truck. There's no need for anything fancy with a crane on it. And as the name suggests, the truck has the tray that tilts to unload the container, and a hydraulic ram will help to push it off. So most towing companies have trucks like this, and they can arrange delivery on pretty short notice. So I would only suggest contacting them directly, because this is how we saved another $200 compared to the price quoted by the depot. So as an example of the delivery costs out there in 2023 in Australia, for a 120 kilometer trip that takes 1.5 hours, we paid $400. And so that's the main consideration with delivery. The more distance the driver needs to travel, the more you'll pay. So that's just something to keep in mind when you see containers that are further away but better priced, because the delivery cost might actually outweigh any savings that you'd potentially make from a cheaper container that's further away. All right, so we had some nice measuring done for the container over here. but unfortunately the way the truck dropped it off, it's gonna need to be moved. And of course these pavers over here got squished. The other one's broken, so let's do some moving around ourselves. We were pretty lucky that there was a digger on the farm that I could use, but this is obviously not the only way to elevate a shipping container. Considering a 20-foot container only weighs about 2 tons, it's the same weight as a normal 4x4 ute. So using the forklift points on the container, this job could also be done with any decent car jack. That said, it was cool to get some more experience on the digger. The only downside is that it does wreck the grass that you drive over, so here's my attempt at smoothing that out a little. And now over to the other side. After hooking the chains to the mounting points and placing a blanket so that we don't do too much damage in case the container slides towards the bucket, this side was also lifted up onto some blocks. Alright, so here is the final location of the shipping container. We've got a couple of blocks on the rear side here, a couple of blocks there. So you can see the container is slightly elevated off the ground, and that's just so it's not sitting on damp ground all day long. So on the front here we have Luna and Rufus, and you can see there's 3 pavers here and Coco. So the only thing to be mindful of is if you've got limited space like us here, the door will want to keep traveling back. So I drove a post in the ground to hold it in place. And so of course also having that door held by the peg there is pretty important for windy days, because if the wind picks up, it's going to smash the door straight back into the container. And the other thing you may have noticed is that there's 3 pavers there and there's 2 pavers back there. And that's because when I checked the levels of the ground, which I'll show you in the next section. So when I checked the level of the ground, I saw that it was relatively flat. And what I didn't want is for it to be leaning towards us, because then water might potentially be running off the top there. And if we were to open this door, it would want to come back around. So I wanted the water to be directed in that direction over there, and for the door to open nicely and rest on that peg there, which is also really important because if the wind's smacking the door around, it's gonna hit into this wall and it's gonna rip some of the paint off. So next up, let's have a look at some images for how we determine the level of the ground. I'll keep this one nice and simple because this is not a complicated process. I started out using a tape measure and a couple of pegs with a string line and this little string line level, which was pretty cool. And I was working on this part of the project alone, and it's amazing the things we think of when no one's around. Like in this instance, I learnt to use the hammer in place of hammering a peg each time, or in the place of someone else holding the string line when checking levels. And so based on the levels, I could see that the door end of the shipping container needed to have 1 extra block on each side to avoid it sloping in that direction. The last and most rewarding part was finally having a dry and secure place for all of our tools that have been stored in the most random places over the past year. Alright, so after all of that rearranging, here's the final result. And for anyone wondering what a 20-foot shipping container can fit, here's a good example. There's plenty of space to walk still, and we've got the ladder, axe and sledgehammer, toolboxes, gardening gear, camping gear, our mowers, clothes drying racks, pump, generator, all of the jerry cans with fuel and water, a table for some working space. There's the Slasher organic weed killer from the last video, and there's even some shovels and even room for workout gear. So it's not a big space really, 6 meters, but it's huge for us. This is basically all that we own, and now it's out of the elements, which is great.